All right, in my 40 years as a pastor, I have seen major changes in the Protestant church in America. Okay, now a lot of this started before I became a pastor. I was ordained in 1982. So a lot of it happened before. But because I was born and raised in a small town in North Dakota, my understanding of the wider church was limited. I was like most Protestants in this country, especially before World War II. Okay? This is a country of immigrants, right? If we're not an immigrant, we're ancestors of immigrants. With the exception of the indigenous peoples who were here before Europeans were, and their ancestors were all immigrants. So when these immigrants left, and I shared, I can't remember now who I shared this with, but I shared a little bit about my own great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, I think it was. Anyway, he was born on a small farm on a fjord in Norway. These farms are very small. Yeah. But anyway, back in those days, in the 1800s, the oldest son would inherit the farm. And the families often were very large. My great-grandfather came from a family of 11 children. So in Norway at that time, all of his sisters would have gotten married. That's how they would have married someone who made a living doing something. And if you weren't the eldest son, you had to do something else. Well, on a fjord in Norway, there was nothing else. Forget it. I mean, there were some artisans, who made things that were necessary for people. But so what he did was what so many of the immigrants who came to this country did. He left his home. He immigrated here, and at that time, Congress had enacted the Homestead Act. Okay? So the indigenous people, the people we used to call Indians, were moved to reservations, right? That opened up all this land. And immigrants were allowed to farm a certain number of acres. I forget how many it was. And if they farmed them for something like 6 years, they gave them title to the land. All right? So on both my mother and my father's side, that's what they did. The question is, how did these people, once they left all the ties they had in their homeland, family, extended community, everything, they left all that behind. Church, everything. How did they recreate a home when they came here? How did they do it? They built churches. That's how they did it. That's why in the same hometown I came from, there was like 5 or 6 different Lutheran churches. One was a Norwegian Lutheran church, another a Swedish Lutheran church, another a Danish Lutheran church, and another a German Lutheran church, right? They created communities by establishing churches. That way they could belong to something that was bigger than just their own family. And they could find intimate, by intimate I don't mean marriage, I mean close relationships with other people that way. That's how that's how Protestantism in this country became such a massive influence on our culture. Okay, now most of the Protestants who came here didn't come here for, well, I don't know the percentages, but initially most of the Protestants who came here as dissenters of the established churches in Europe, right? The Puritans were dissenters of the Church of England, as were the Quakers, the Methodists, and there's another group that's escaping me right now. Several groups that were dissenters of the Church of England left Britain and came here. Dissenters from the official Lutheran Church in Germany came here. And other groups that were not accepted were invited by William Penn to come to Pennsylvania. Okay, Mennonites, Amish, Moravians, smaller groups. So a lot of people came here as dissenters. Some came here as for economic reasons. And some people came also from Roman Catholic countries like Italy, Ireland during the potato famine. There was a massive number of Irish immigrants. And Spain and Poland. Okay, there were a large number of Polish immigrants. Okay, so what did the Catholics do? They did the same thing. There were Polish Catholic parishes, there were Italian Catholic parishes, and there were, Spanish Catholic parishes. So they did the same thing. And it was even more important for the Catholics to do it because this country was governed by Protestants. And you probably remember, even as recent as the election of 1960, putting a Catholic in the White House was controversial. Remember that? Yeah. Okay, so that's how influential, Protestantism formed American culture from top to bottom. Okay, so what we're going to look at now, a very important historian, Martin Marty. Have you ever heard that name? Okay, he's a Lutheran. Was a Lutheran. He taught at the University of Chicago, a very prestigious university, and he taught American church history. I'm not sure if he taught anything else, but I know he taught that. He wrote one book I read about it. It's called Pilgrims in Their Own Land. He said Protestants in America have divided up into two separate groups. Now, whenever you start dividing things up into, separate groups, you got to remember that there are people that don't always fit the mold. You can't stereotype everybody. So this is just roughly the way it divides up. Okay. So Protestants in America are either mainline Protestants, or what are sometimes called ecumenical Protestants, are the people who attend established Protestant denomination churches. Lutherans, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Disciples of Christ, etc., etc. Okay, established Protestant denominations. Okay, then there's the evangelicals. Okay, now evangelical churches, sometimes you can find a group of evangelicals that are a part of a Protestant denomination. That's becoming less and less true. But we have an example nearby, right? The church in Menlo Park, Presbyterian, used to be Presbyterian, right? It's not anymore. Okay? Evangelicals tend to separate themselves from mainline Protestants. They have a completely different understanding of the gospel. All right? So you've got mainline churches and you've got evangelical churches, and the two have a completely different perspective on the meaning of the Christian faith. That's not to say there isn't some commonality, there is. But the emphasis of each of them is different. Okay. So the way I'm going to approach this, what I want to do in this class is look at how did this happen? What constitutes a mainline Protestant church? And what constitutes an evangelical church? What is their emphasis? How are they different? How did this develop historically? And then, of course, I'm not a historian. I enjoy history. It's a hobby, but I'm not a trained historian. I'm a pastor and a theologian. So when I approach this topic, I don't just look at the history of how these two groups developed. I look at it from the point of view of my understanding of our primary documents as Christians, which is the New Testament. My understanding of the New Testament. And so I look at the two groups from the point of view of a theologian. Do I agree with this group? Do I agree with this aspect of what is going on in mainline Protestantism or evangelical Protestantism? Do I think it's faithful to Scripture, understood through a lens of Reformation theology? Or do I think it's not? Okay, so, but we're also going to look at the history of how this developed, and for that I used this book. It was just published in 2022. It's written by a historian of American religion. His name is David Hollinger. He teaches at UC Berkeley. It's called Christianity's American Fate. All right? Now, he's a good historian. He does his history very well. But he has a point of view. Everybody has a point of view. Everybody has their own biases, political, cultural, and otherwise, religious. And some of his come through with this. Okay, so I don't agree with everything he says, because, like I say, I approach it from the point of view of a Lutheran theologian. But as a work of history, it's very good. Now before I go any further, I want to share with you some things that Judy, where did you find this information?
There's a reference on the bottom of the source. There's a census that's done every year.
Oh, okay. Okay. So what she gave me here is a handout on Christian trends in San Mateo County. First, the demographics. Okay? So in San Mateo County, the demographics are 37.4% white, 31.8% Asian, 24% Hispanic, only 2.8% black. Island Pacific is too small to, or it's 1.4. Native American 0.9, and 2 or more races 5.1. So it's a very diverse county, right? The city is a little more white, but not much, 40.9%. So, yeah. Okay, now of that group, 13% identify as Hispanic Catholic, 12% as white Catholic. Okay, those are the two biggest groups in San Mateo.
What was the second percentage?
White Catholic, white Catholic, Caucasian.
Together, they're about 25% Catholic.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the biggest religious group in San Mateo County. So white Protestant, that's where hope would be. 7%. 7%. Hispanic Protestant, 4%, 2% Black Protestant, 4% white evangelical. So there's not as many evangelicals here. But if you were to go to a southern state, it would be a lot more. There's more evangelicals in the American South than there is around here. Okay, now, the other thing that's rather interesting, okay, do you see these lines?
And that's a national trend.
Yeah, this is national. Okay, so the line that's gone up the most is unaffiliated. In other words, the nuns. Okay, in the last poll taken, 62% of Americans identified as Christian. That's the lowest it's ever been. By far the lowest. It used to be over 90%. Yeah. As early as 2001 or 2 or something, it was at 90%. Now it's 62%. The line that's going down the most is
Evangelical.
yeah, white evangelical. Okay, so they started out as 23% back in 2006, and now they're down to 14.6%.
Are these percentages of Christians or all people?
Just evangelicals. Those were evangelicals. Okay, the mainline Christians in 2006 were 17.8% of the population. Now they're 13.9%. And the white Catholic is 13.2%. So white Protestants and white Catholics are very close to the same in the population. And that's a big change throughout our history. Big change. Yeah. So, but the most startling part is the number of people who have become unaffiliated. And they also do it by age group. So if you are between the ages of 18 and 29, 34% of them are unaffiliated. No religion. If you're between the ages of 30 and 49, 31% are unaffiliated. If you're between the ages of 50 and 64, 19% are unaffiliated. And if you're at 65 plus, which is where most of us are, 16% are unaffiliated. So that group is the most church-going group, 65 plus. It's the most church-going group. Yeah. So if you go to any mainline Protestant church, that's what you're going to find, older folks, yeah, by and large. There are some exceptions, but that's what's going on in this country right now, okay?
So one more demographic I just want to call your attention to. For San Mateo in particular, you have a really large, sorry, I'm hearing myself, a really large percentage of people that were born overseas, not born in the United
Right.
States. And that was included there, somewhere around 50%.
Yeah.
And you have more than 50% who do not speak English as their primary language at home.
Right.
So that also changes the demographics and sort of church-going characteristics quite a bit, depending on if you come from a Catholic country or if you come from a country that has no religion.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so, it's very interesting. Okay, so, now let me say a few words about the beginnings of our history and how our culture and religion interacted. Okay, things have changed now. We're going to have to try to put ourselves in the shoes of people that lived in America 100, 150, 200 years ago. Okay, what were their values? How did they live? What did they think? What was important to them? You know, and how did they understand the role of religion in their lives? Okay. To understand how Protestantism separated into these two groups, you have to look at the history of Protestantism over time and the culture of America over time. Okay. As the country expanded, during the administration of Thomas Jefferson was president from 1800 to 1808. He was famous for what expansion in this country? Louisiana Purchase, okay? That gave us a huge amount of land that we didn't have before, beyond the Allegheny Mountains. Okay, that's the Appalachian chain. Okay, the Appalachians are close to the eastern seaboard. From Washington, D.C., you can be up to into the Appalachians in less than an hour. They're in the initial ones. Louisiana Purchase was beyond that mountain chain. So when waves of immigrants came to America, what they were looking for was land to farm. That's what they were looking for. This was an agricultural country, by and large. All right. Now there was some manufacturing that developed mostly in New England and New York and down to Philadelphia. But as soon as you got south of Washington, D.C., it was all agriculture. All right? And then as you went west, after the Louisiana Purchase, all of a sudden new states were formed because so many people were moving out there. Okay? Think, for example, of the state of Indiana. Indiana was part of the Louisiana Purchase. And at the time it was purchased, it was all forest. It was covered in trees. But if you drive through Indiana now, what do you see? All farms. There's a few trees, but not very many. All right? So new states were formed. Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, etc. Okay? Began coming into the Union. All right? Who were these people and what kind of culture did they develop? Okay, I can tell you a little bit about what they personally valued. What they personally valued were the following characteristics, which is why they came here. Number one, they highly valued self-reliance. Right? They thought, they believed that people ought to be able to be self-reliant, that was the best way to ensure your own well-being and see to your own needs. Self-reliance. Secondly, they valued freedom. Okay, if you value self-reliance, you're going to value freedom. Freedom to do what you want. Okay? So these were people who valued the freedom to live as they pleased, to be self-reliant, and to be free of any government interference in their lives. Okay, they believed that's what the American ideal was. The federal government had two roles. Number one, the common defense, which people accepted as necessary. Although in the United States, the United States never had big armies until the World Wars. When the Civil War broke out, the Army had about 16,000 people in it. That's it. So they had to, get all the citizens into the Army, and it became a citizen army is what it became. Okay, so they were people who were suspicious of authority. They didn't want. It wouldn't be unusual to see a sign that said, "We don't want anything to do with the federal government." It would not be unusual to see back in those days. Okay, people's allegiance was more to their state than to the Union. All right, so when the southern states seceded, they believed they had every right to do so. This is a free country. Why can't we freely choose to leave the Union if we want? All right, and their allegiance was to their state. General Lee was asked to take control of the Northern Army. He said, "I can't because my allegiance is to Virginia." So, what is the role of religion for people in that kind of a culture? Okay, first of all, how did religion get to those people? These are people who moved out into the what was then a wilderness. They cleared the land, they made farms, there were small towns where you could find a blacksmith and a tanner and those kinds of things. With that kind of a culture, what happened is that the churches realized they needed to get out into the frontier and evangelize these people, because there were no churches at the time in many of these places. So evangelistic preachers would travel into the frontier areas and have revival meetings. Okay, they would schedule them well in advance. People would come, and these preachers, they could get a crowd in the palm of their hand. And people reacted in the craziest ways. I mean, they started speaking in tongues, they started rolling around. I mean, it looked like they were all drunk. But to them, that was the Holy Spirit. That was the Holy Spirit. Okay? So these evangelical preachers are spreading the gospel throughout the frontier, and in the wake of this happened twice. It was called the Great Awakening. 2 of those happened in our history. One before we became an independent country, and one after. Okay? In the wake of these evangelistic events, people started to build churches further west. Okay? Along the eastern seaboard, let me see if you give you a little test of your history here. Along the eastern seaboard, what was the most common kind of Protestant church in early American history? All the way through to even after the Civil War. The most common kind of Protestant church. Episcopalian. Church of England. Yeah, it was Church of England. Okay, and that was the most common. But that wasn't the most common of the evangelistic preachers who went out into the frontier. Which denominations did they come from? Baptist. There's another big one they came from. Baptist, Methodist. Those 2. Yeah. They're the ones that went out and really evangelized. Baptist and Methodist. Okay? So think about the Baptist church for a minute. Because that's one of the biggest Protestant denominations. Well, it is the biggest Protestant denomination is Baptist. Okay? During the Civil War, the Baptist church broke up into the Northern Baptist Church, which opposed slavery, and the Southern Baptist Church, which supported slavery. Okay? To this day, you've got a Northern Baptist Church and the Southern Baptist Convention, right? You all heard about the Southern Baptist Convention?
Yes.
Yeah. They have a lot of clout. Yeah. And they lean a little bit evangelical. Okay? Because they're Southern. Right? And I'll define that for you here in a second. And the Northern Baptist Church is strictly mainline. Okay? Let me give you an example of a mainline, what a mainline preacher does. Kirsten and I were married by a Northern Baptist pastor in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. All right? So he was right there in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. Okay? And his name was Bob Seymour. Kirsten didn't like the architecture of that church, so we got married in a Methodist church. Which she liked better. Okay. So a Baptist married a Lutheran in a Methodist church. Okay. This guy was mainline to the core. He was the first Baptist pastor to integrate his church with African Americans. That was controversial in those days. Okay? But he was an activist to the core. He was involved in community affairs and social issues and politics. He believed that the gospel imperative was to make the world a better place, to get involved in politics, social issues, all of that. He was extremely active in those things. All right? Now, you would never find that same, maybe today you would, but back in those days, you would never have found that in the Southern Baptist Church.
You would never have found what?
You would never have found an activist pastor in a Southern Baptist church. Why? Because in a culture of self-reliant people who value freedom above all other things, the gospel is primarily functions in two ways in your life. Number one, if you have a society where everybody's free, but you don't have a moral code, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have chaos, right? And there was chaos in the Old West. There was chaos, okay? Ex-Confederates went west and became outlaws, right? Okay. So number one, you need a moral code. That's what religion is for, to teach morality. Okay, so we have a country where church and state are separate. The state doesn't do that. The state is not supposed to be teaching people morality. Now, I'm talking as if I'm one of these people now. The state stays out of that. That's for the church to do. Okay?
But isn't moral standards around the world? I mean, it isn't just Christianity. Other countries have moral standards, how to deal with people.
Okay, well, you're talking like a mainline Christian now. I'm trying to express to you how evangelicals think. Okay? Mainline Christians are the ones who did the missionary work overseas. They're the ones that learned about other religions. Not evangelicals, mainliners. They were the ones who did the missionary stuff. Okay? And it changed Protestantism. It changed it in the sense that mainline Protestants have become far more open to racial and ethnic diversity. In fact, it's a value for mainline Protestants to be diverse ethnically and racially because of their encounter with other peoples through their missionary work. All right? Evangelicals were more turned in just to this country. All right? So no, and the other thing you have to remember, Lyle, is that I'm talking about what was going on a long time ago. Yeah, okay. So, the church was to teach morality and to preach personal salvation. Those two things. That's what the gospel was about. It wasn't about changing the world. It wasn't about changing social conditions. It wasn't about getting active in politics. It wasn't about any of that. Okay, to this day, when Billy Graham's son comes on an advertisement on TV, and he regularly advertises on Fox, he comes on and he says, just say this prayer. Lord, I'm a sinner. I believe that your son came and died for me on the cross, and I ask for your forgiveness. Now you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and you know your eternal soul has been securely saved. Okay? That's the emphasis. Right? There's nothing about, it's necessary for the church to get involved in the racial issues in this country. It's necessary for the church to get involved in the wealth gap between rich and poor. It's necessary for Christians to be concerned about those who are marginalized and left out. It's necessary, blah, blah, to make the world a better place for everybody. That's mainline Christianity. Evangelical Christianity is more about your own personal salvation. So it's more turned inward and about personal morality. All right, so, I want to say one thing about Lutheranism that is a little, okay, it's a little different, okay? There used to be many Lutheran synods, okay? Let me just talk about my time. In my time, from 1955 to the present, to start with, there was the American Lutheran Church, which was primarily Scandinavian background. There was the Lutheran Church in America, which was primarily German background, and which went back to colonial times, which is why the seminaries were in Gettysburg and Philadelphia. The seminaries for the American Lutheran Church were where? Minneapolis, Wartburg. This is all Midwest. We did have one in Columbia, South Carolina as well, and we still do.
And wasn't there one in Ohio?
Yes, Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah.
Yeah. there was.
Augustana,
Uh,
Illinois,
Maybe so. I'm not familiar with that one.
that was the Swedish.
Yeah, and there was one in Chicago, the Lutheran School of Theology. Okay. So, all right, so there was the ALC, and now the LCA was the most progressive mainline among Lutherans. The ALC was kind of in the middle. All right, we didn't emphasize politics, but people in the ALC were involved in missionary work and were involved in, I had an aunt and uncle. This illustrates how the missionary work changed people. I had an aunt and uncle who went to Africa as missionaries. And for about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And missionaries weren't primarily people who went to build churches and convert the heathen. That isn't what their purpose was. My aunt and uncle went there as teachers. They taught, okay? English and other things, all right? And they got to know the native Africans who were a part of that mission area. Missionaries also provided health care and other things, okay? It was more than just establishing churches. I mean, they did establish some churches, but the interesting thing that happened is when they encountered the indigenous people of places like Africa and Asia and other parts of the world, they came to appreciate not only racial diversity, not only ethnic diversity, but also cultural and religious diversity. So my aunt and uncle, they used to send back, every Christmas, they sent back artifacts that were carved by African people as Christmas gifts. And they came back to Minnesota as changed people. Their encounter with the Africans changed them. They had a much greater appreciation for the culture and the people. When you get to know people face to face, they're not just some distant group that believes differently than you do. And you develop this image in your mind of who they are. When you get to know them face to face, you discover that they're human beings just like you are. Right? Yeah.
Travel does that too.
Travel can do that too, yeah. Okay, so, so I'm out of time for now, but If you read this, I go into more detail on the roots of evangelicalism and mainline Protestantism. And what I want to do next week is come into, I want to cover the period of time from the civil rights movement to the present. Okay? Because that's when the changes really, the changes in America. World War II changed America enormously. Number one, it turned us into the biggest industrial country on the planet. Because we had to build all these airplanes, all these tanks, all this military equipment. Number two, it made Americans more mobile. They moved to where the jobs were. Number three, when the war was over and the guys came home, they passed the GI Bill, and more people started to go to college than ever before. Higher education. Okay? And what that did is it took them out of the places where they were born. And it introduced them to new places. Okay, so if you're going to college, suppose you grew up in a small town in Iowa, and you decide you want to go to Columbia University. All of a sudden, you're out of your small town and you're in the middle of New York City. Well, that's going to change you, right?
Sure is.
It's going to change you a lot, okay? That's what happened in the post-war years. The changes in the post-war years were enormous in this country. Prior to that, people stayed in the places where they were born, whether it was a city or a small town or a farm. People stayed where they were born. Now you can see that if you go to any big city on the East Coast, and I think this is true of San Francisco too. I learned this when I lived in suburban Baltimore. Okay, Baltimore's a big city, but it has neighborhoods with individual names. And in the middle of each of these neighborhoods is a big church. Now, in the pre-war years, people who grew up in those neighborhoods, the church was the center of their community activity. And they identified with not the city of Baltimore, but with their neighborhood. Okay? In Brooklyn, there was a Norwegian neighborhood with many Lutheran churches, and they used to have parades on Sutton Mai. So people tended to be narrower focused on their neighborhoods or on their small towns and farms. But after the war, Americans started to, what did Eisenhower do? He built the interstate system. Because what were Americans doing? They were traveling all over the place. And it changed us. Okay, we'll do that next week.